Welcome to another episode of the Volkswagen Art for All online edition. I am Sven Beckstätte, curator at Hamburger Bahnhof Museum für Gegenwart, Berlin. In the October issue, we continue to talk about art and music. This time, our guest is Stan Douglas. His work, Dirty V's Breeze and Mime, can be seen at the moment in the exhibition Magical Soup, Media Art from the Nationalgalerie Collection, the Friedrich Christian Flick Collection at Hamburger Bahnhof, and Loans. Apart from that, there are several works by Stan Douglas in the collection of the Nationalgalerie, like Der Sandmann, that were donated by Friedrich Christian Flick. Stan Douglas was born in 1960 in Vancouver, where he also lives today. He participated 3 times in Documenta and was selected to represent Canada at the Venice Biennial in 2022. From early on, music played a key role in his video installations. Today, we are very happy to have a telephone conversation with Stan in Vancouver. Welcome, Stan. I read that before you studied art, you worked as a DJ in a club in Vancouver. Did DJing have an influence on your artistic practice?
For about 2 years, I was working as a DJ professionally. Every Friday, I was playing at a club in Vancouver, and just kind of happened. The club was kind of like quiet on weekends, or their tea dance on Saturday was a big thing, but not much was happening on Fridays. I kind of pitched them idea because I worked at the coffee bar next door. I said, if I played records, my friends would come. We did that, and it actually was quite successful for a while. But during that process, I learned more and more about what it is to work with a DJ, how you kind of create an environment, create an event using music, and using existing cultural material to make new cultural events, which is kind of key for my artistic practice. Although I kind of ended because my musical interest began to grow, and I was kind of tired of spending all my money on dance records. I eventually quit after a couple of years, and I tried to work at a larger club, and they wanted to tell me what to play. I didn't like that, so I just kind of backed off from that. But around this time was just after I graduated from art school, and the school I went to was kind of antagonistic towards language, and so I made a point of reading some long novels to get my chops on literature and that kind of thing. And one of those novels was Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann. And toward the end, I believe, there's a very amazing description of Beethoven's Opus 111, which made me have to go and find that piece of music. I wasn't really that versed with classical music, but there is an episode in the second movement where it sounds almost exactly like ragtime. And I made one of my first musical pieces based on that. I found a company who could cut player piano rolls, so I had them cut that episode as well as sort of framing episodes around it onto a player piano roll to make this ragtime sounding music sound even more like ragtime. This first piece from 1986 was called Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia, of course, is a word which sounds like the thing it represents. And of course, the fact that we hear ragtime in Beethoven means that we can't hear the music that Beethoven heard. So I was kind of interested in that condition. But realizing finding out that Adorno was the musical advisor to Thomas Mann on that novel, I began to sort of look up his work. And his writing on music was kind of illuminating to me because I understood music not the way he describes it, which is in a way in which the musical form has a condensation of the cultural ideas of the time in which it was made, which I never really thought about before. Now, Dorner himself is famously antagonistic towards jazz, but I think there's a couple reasons why that is. First of all, he probably never really heard proper jazz. He only mentions one person by name, and that's Benny Goodman, which is not what I would consider to be proper jazz. It somehow represents the commodity form in its form by advertising itself in the music. But in jazz music, I think a key thing is that it is being made by people who themselves were commodities until the 19th century, African Americans. And the very thing which Adorno valorizes in Beethoven is piano music. Opus 111 has a very kind of a sentimental theme, which is then kind of redeemed by the variations, just as, say, the Diabelli variations is based on he says somewhere, I can't remember where, but says somewhere that this sort of terrible waltz by Diabelli is redeemed by Beethoven's variations. The same thing happens in jazz when a 10-pan alley song is taken and then elaborated upon later on.
It was in Dödewe's Breeze and Mine from 1982-83 that you brought together the white European classical tradition and the black tradition of jazz and blues.
In a way, the Dödewe's is really more about, or my interest was more about the lyrics than about the music itself, although the music itself kind of represents a more general cultural condition that is being addressed somehow. In Breath, there are these subtitles translating the French lyrics from this art song by Charles Gounod, in which the singer is talking about his object of desire as being kind of a rebel. So it's in a way projecting upon the other their desire and sort of trying to determine what the other should be or how the other should think.
Qu'en de petits gestes, tout divin, tout céleste, en amoureuse ardeur, tu plonges tout mon cœur. En amoureuse ardeur, tu plonges tout mon cœur. Oh ma belle rebelle, lorsque tu m'es cruelle, quand la cuisante ardeur qui me brûle le cœur fait que je te...
In part two, Mine, you have almost like My Lips in a series of different configurations, occasionally appearing to animate in lip sync with a Robert Johnson song called Preachin' Blues, in which the singer is talking about seeing all of their blues, all of their fears, all of their nightmares sort of manifest as a person. So it's seeing oneself outside of oneself.
I was up this morning, up blues, walking like a man. Up this morning, I blues walking like a man. What a blues, give me your right hand.
And in many ways, this speaks to the idea of double consciousness, the idea that from W.B. Du Bois, where Du Bois, they call it in the States, where African Americans understand themselves as themselves, or understand themselves as the other, as they're being looked on by a white gaze. And so this work kind of plays with these ideas, almost through the idea of language and speech, language belonging to the European language being presented in Breath, and then speech which is always a kind of an act of ventriloquism that we see in Mime, where you speak words which are not your own in order to represent yourself. And that's kind of the ultimate paradox of language, where how do you build your own identity through things which are not your own.
Another work, Pursuit, Fear, Catastrophe, Ruskin, BC from 1993, is based on a composition by Arnold Schönberg.
Yeah, so Pursuit of Free Catastrophe is based on, I guess, a challenge that I felt I got from Arnold Schoenberg, where he says he made that piece of music, accompaniment to a cinematographic scene, a musical accompaniment to a film that could not be made. So of course I had to go and make that film, almost as a challenge. And the conceit really is sort of a historical coincidence that at the same time he was composing that music, there is a community of Japanese berry farmers established in this place called Ruskin, BC, the site of a previous utopian community on that location. People, followers of John Ruskin, established this sort of quote-unquote socialist community, commune out there. And the Japanese berry farmers couldn't have certain kinds of work in Vancouver because of sort of racist laws, and they were able to sort of find autonomy in this place. But of course, the war happened, and they were declared enemy aliens and taken to concentration camps in the interior of BC. So that was kind of a catastrophe that befell them, much like that of the Jewish composers like Schoenberg. So there's parallels, but it's all kind of fuzzy in some way. It kind of felt right, but I couldn't really make a very sort of logical argument for why I put these two things together. But I sort of took this form of music from the period, the 1920s, I guess, when you still had player pianos or silent films and piano accompaniment, and I made a silent film to go along with the Schoenberg piece, which is it begins silent, and the music starts when a lie is told, and it gets up to sort of a climax, and then once the lie is uncovered and made right, the music stops. So really, the music is all about this condition of a person being accused of a crime, a Japanese man being accused of a crime, and once he's sort of released from that problem, everything goes silent again. So it's I guess a 15-minute, 16-mil film, silent film that goes with a fancy disc clavier Yamaha piano, computer MIDI-controlled piano.
Your video installation Hors Champ from 1992 refers to free jazz and its reception in Europe. For this video installation, you worked together with George Lewis.
I was in Paris trying to understand what I was going to do. I actually had gone there at the invitation of Christine Vanache, a curator at the Pompidou Center, who knew they had a TV studio that no one ever used. So she invited video artists to go and make videos there. And I began to get more involved in looking at what was happening in the French cultural scene. And I became kind of fascinated by a guy named Jean-Christophe Avertet, who was a producer responsible for a lot of these jazz programs on TV. First live broadcasts from clubs in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but later these studio productions, which I kind of mimicked in our shop, where it's often very abstract, often very stark black and white, with flats sort of making contrast. And then often involving close-ups of musicians' hands, but not really recording the ensemble interaction that makes jazz what jazz is. As I was researching, I went to a place called INA, which was the Audiovisual Foundation in France, and I was very kind of Kafkaesque, these weird circular hallways and these shopping carts filled with open-reel quarter-inch audio tape. And I requested a few different recordings to listen to. And one of them was the first concert of Albert Ayler in Paris. And it's kind of amazing where, it broke a number of times, but this is where I heard for the first time Spirits Rejoice, which I was not that familiar with his work. And so once after it broke numerous times, I re-spliced it, listened to it, wiped the tears from my eyes, and then called the curator of the archive, and they took the tapes, put them in a shopping cart, and probably no one has ever heard those recordings again. But what I heard in that music was, even though Eiler is kind of known as being a kind of wild performer, I realized there's a very subtle musicology going on in that work, where he was basically deconstructing the French national anthem, the Marseillaise, which is sort of famously racist, but trying to find a place for himself in that context by interposing it with motifs from American music, a gospel melody, a call and response, and a fanfare. So all these kind of like meld together in that music, which is quite kind of extraordinary. And so, I'd been interviewing people in Paris. Sonny Murray, who is a bass player for Eiler, Alvin Silva, who played with Eiler as well, and Sonny Rana, Steve Potts, and a few other people, and Stephen Lacey. And I became in contact with George Lewis, who's the musical director for the piece, and I kind of said, I met these people in Paris, and maybe we can make an ensemble out of this. He goes, and George says, those people will kill each other. You don't want them to play together. So he said, let me put it together, and he found a more simpatico group of players to play the piece, which is what you see in our shop.
How would you describe your relationship to George Lewis? Because he later on also wrote theoretical texts about your work, and especially on Suspiria, which is a great essay actually.
Oh yeah, George and I are good friends. We're in contact when we can be. When I get to New York, he does come to Vancouver now and then. But I've learned a lot from that relationship, and perhaps he made me more aware of computer music, which probably led to what I did later on with the recombinant narrative pieces. Because in a way that, both that plus a knowledge of serialism, which I'd kind of picked up earlier on, led to this sort of organization of time, narrative time in the recombinant pieces that you see in those later works. But the key thing in Orchamps was having a relationship between the cameras and the music, to have be able to improvise with the cameras to see what's going on, to record that, even though it's not the focus of attention, because at certain episodes of music, one camera has to be on a sort of formalized, predetermined shot, while the other camera is free to sort of search around to see what the players are doing. At another point in music, that camera has to be on its formalized shot, and the edit happens, and that the previous camera is now free to look around. So it took a lot of choreography, and the sort of staff hired one DOP for the piece, but the staff camera operator was very, very lazy, and when he was not shooting his shot, he just let the camera drop, and so it was like pointing at the floor. Eventually, I had to sort of take him off and did the operating myself, which is kind of accounts for some uncomfortable framing now and then, but that was my first experience as a camera operator under duress. And in many ways, this piece was kind of an allegory of African Americans' sort of self-exile in Europe, finding a different way of life for many musicians that they couldn't have if they were living in the United States.
In Pursuit Fear Catastrophe, Ruskin BC, you already referred to a moment of an utopian possibility in history, which is also a key motive of Orchamps and later on in Luanda Kinshasa.
Yeah, I mean, there were concerts organized by the Communist Party with the Ensemble of Chicago and Paris, with thousands of people who attended, because there was thought that this was kind of a model for utopian and social organization. And, you know, I took up that same idea in Luanda Kinshasa, where looking at this, I mean, this record, On the Corner, which I sort of was inspired with that work, was always kind of what utopia sounded like to me. And so the record is only 45 minutes long, so I decided to make more for selfish reasons, so I could hear more, but also to have this image of people working, performing in collaboration in a way that permitted everyone to have a certain kind of freedom, which is kind of a key idea in that piece. Yeah, it's somehow like akin to speculative fiction, where something that could have happened, which didn't happen. Miles Davis was always interested in being popular, and so he thought with this record On the Corner, somehow if he mixed jazz funk with Indian classical music, he would be a big hit with the kids. Of course, it was his worst-selling record of all time, even though well regarded by many people. But I thought at exactly this time he was making that record, Madame Dibango's Sol Makossa was a huge hit in the disco underground. So what if Miles had picked up on that and sort of tried to make a combination of what he was doing with On the Corner with Afrobeat, and so that's what we try to achieve in Luanda Kinshasa. There's basically two songs, of which there are many variations. First one is called Luanda, which has got the Afrobeat feel. There's Kinshasa, which has got more of the rock feel. And hoping to sort of place the time based on the fact that Miles often named songs after liberation struggles in Africa. And of course, in the mid-70s, Angola was liberated from Portuguese colonialism. Is getting a civil war for 22 years. But also there's the rumble in the jungle, and the music concert in Kinshasa as well. So that kind of connects to this period in hopefully a clear way. And what happens is we have two cameras, which are kind of one camera, and shot in over 2 days. One day we shoot all the rhythm instruments. Next day we shoot all the lead instruments on opposite sides of the studio. And then these are montaged together to make new music. They never actually played together at the same time. It was all construction of the studio, which somehow mimics what Miles was doing with his producer, Tia Macero, in that period, where they basically had these long jams in the studio, and then Tia and Miles would go with the splicing block and reassemble and build the music, finish composing music in the studio. So this happens in a more complex way in Luanda Kinshasa because I had both edit the music and the visuals. So you couldn't have somebody not playing what you're hearing, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. So that was the most challenging aspect of finishing the work. And the first 4 or 5 songs I was able to do by myself, learning how to sort of cull extraneous music to sort of tease out an idea of a song in certain episodes. But my producer, Scott Harding, had to come in for the last 5 or 6 because my first attempts just didn't make any musical sense. He goes, "Oh my God, those are different keys. You can't do that." So he gave me some more guidance on how to make that happen. But the main conceit is to sort of making fun of the Rolling Stones and their show, the Godard movie, 1+1 or Sympathy for the Devil, in which they're spending days and days trying to figure out how to compose that song. And then when the colors come in, finally it gels. But this is more like a geyser of music where they're sort of spewing out sort of new music constantly, virtually without end.
Next to Scott Harding, you also collaborated with Jason Moran, who can be seen playing piano.
Basically, it seems kind of fated somehow. Like I was planning to go see Jason's band with Scott and at Birdland, I think it was. And then I kept him. And then I did a talk at Columbia, and Jason was there and said, "Have you ever thought of doing anything live?" And I said, "Well, I had this idea for doing the opera Lulu, but that didn't work out very well." And then he came to me later and said, "That's amazing because I've been studying that score for the past year." And then later on, I kept on bumping into Jason in Soho, in Chelsea. So it seemed kind of fated that we would work together. And when I thought about doing One Kinshasa, I just thought of him being connected to that scene would be a good musical director for the piece. And so I kind of laid out the instruments I wanted, and then he showed me the YouTube clips of people, and we built the band based on that, his connections. Yeah, later on, I was showing it in London, associated with the Vinyl Factory, and they said, let's make a record. And so I thought, great. And I told Jason, he says, that's great, but the contract with the musicians was only for that video, not for recording. That's how they make their living. So we have to get paid again. So we did the right thing, and everybody's happy.
Your most complex piece of recombinant narrative is Suspiria from 2003 that you showed at Documenta, and in which you refer to a film by Dario Argento with a soundtrack by Italian prog rock band Goblin.
But this sort of culminated in Suspiria, which is somehow takes this arbitrage idea to sort of new heights, where we have 256 different narrative elements, 7 songs, of which there are as many as 35 components or stems, which recombine it in various ways to make songs and tell stories that would never repeat itself until after the moment that the sun burns out. So this is basically this huge time scale which this thing works, and it's not kind of impossible for any 2 people to see the same work if it rolls over time. And it's based on the Grimm's fairy tales. Are taking all of the stories about economics in the Grimm's fairy tales and all the stories about witchcraft and the supernatural in Volume 1 of Capital by Marx, and puts those together, in this piece. And because it's a generative system, it gets stranger and stranger over time. And I remember going back to Stuttgart when I had that retrospective in 2007 and visiting Suspiria again and seeing stories I'd never imagined before. Very kind of bizarre combinations of stories, which are quite incredible. But yeah, this is basically based on the film Suspiria. The music is based on the film Suspiria and the look, the very saturated colors of Dario Argento, a horror film where a young woman from North America goes to sort of study European culture at a dance academy, which turns out to be a witch's coven. And for me, that was kind of an allegory of my coming to Documenta to perform where this piece was first shown.
I would gladly trade you your cloth for this.
I bet you've got at least 50. I'll bet you this pistol against half you've got in that bag.
Just want to bet with Elsa. I want the 50 in the bag.
Yeah, it was kind of extraordinary. We had, in documented the live version, we had cameras in this, the Hercules Monument up on the hill, which kind of surveys the entire city, which you can't escape. It's always kind of looking at you, this huge statue of Hercules. So all the cameras were inside that building, and we broadcast the recombined stories, combining surveillance cameras and pre-recorded material that was in the studio in Vancouver, going both to the exhibition hall in Castle and then broadcast on TV at night, which was, I thought if I could get it to run for a day, I'd be happy, but it ran for at least a month, and it was just kind of incredible until people realized it was live and began spray painting slogans inside the Hercules Monument. One saying, kind mentions illegal. Others said, stop deportation. So they realized where the cameras were pointing, what they were looking at, and then put these slogans on walls. And at that point, the city kind of said, this is a public monument. We can't really have people doing this. So we shut it down, and I played recordings after that. But that it ran for more than a day. It was kind of amazing to me because we had this sort of basically a kind of a climate-controlled box with all the equipment. It was like building new songs live and then broadcasting.
For the music, you worked with Scott Hardin and John Medeski.
John Medeski was totally into the musical Goblin, when he heard it. And we were basically had a great time just talking about what kind of motifs to take, what kind of music to make. And I was there for a few sessions. I play some percussion stuff on it as well, but their circle of musicians came in and did various things, like Billy Martin came in and did some tracks, and singers for vocalizations, and it was a great process. We just do some back and forth and to try to figure out how to make these songs work.
And how was it putting that on CD? Because I guess that's even more complicated than Luanda Kinshasa in a way.
Yeah, well, like I say, there's as many as 35 stems in some of the songs, where basically have variations of everything's at the same tempo per song, variations on melody, variations on rhythm, variations on bass, variations on sound effects, and they all had to work together if you played the different parts together. And when it was first done, we basically had a fancy sampler, and basically the computer sends a giant chord to the sampler, and it plays back a selection of those stems simultaneously to play the music. Now everything's kind of like in a computer, like the one Mac Mini plays everything. But back then we had to find an array of DVDs, plus this old school sampler with a hard drive, and then a controller to run everything. So it was very kind of elaborate, but kind of amazing work. Still kind of magical somehow.
And for the vinyl version that came out 10 years later, you made a totally different concept that works on the chance factor that with this recombination method of the computer correspondence, right?
Yeah, the record is what you call a roulette record, where you have interlock grooves that sort of run in parallel. So it spirals inward. So depending on where you drop the needle, when you put on a record, you hear a different version of this song. So each side has one song, but then three variations of that song. But you're never quite sure which one you're going to hear. The first time I got the record, a test pressing deck, I played it, and I played each of the different songs in sequence. But I could never actually reproduce that again. After that, it was like totally random. But it's kind of also the sort of somehow spooky thing.
In the video installation, The Secret Agent from 2015, you extended the method of recombinant narrative into space.
Secret Agent is based on a novel by Joseph Conrad called The Secret Agent, which is based on an actual event when there's a bombing of the Greenwich Observatory in the late 19th century by this person who was kind of associated with sort of anarchist and anarchist groups in London. I think he was a French originally. But I set this in 1975, in the hot summer of 75, a year after the Portuguese Revolution, when you had a lot of extreme left, extreme right-wing groups who were bombing, doing hijackings for very different ends, with very, very different ideological points of view. Because of the sort of fascist government in Portugal, the only political organization that was sort of organized was the Communist Party, because they were associated with the union groups. And both the extreme left and extreme right didn't want the Communist Party taking power, and so this was a lot of turmoil until the Constitution was ratified in the fall of '75. But I just took the sort of this comedy about terrorism that Conrad wrote and transposed it to 1975, and took the bombing of the observatory, which kind of marks time, which is kind of crucial to trade in many ways, and replace that with a network, because these terrorists want to bomb the Marconi installation at Sesimbra, which connects telephony between Europe and the New World. So it's kind of a key difference. But many of the characters nicely correspond, where we have originally in Conrad's novel, the secret agent Verloc was Polish living in London and naturalized because he was born there. In my case, the Verloc was born in Porto with English parents who had a winery or something, and also naturalized. He had been in Paris and in May '68 and sort of got in trouble there. And then Ossipon is a Maoist pamphleteer. There's a ex-political prisoner, also corresponding with the two stories. And then what else is there? There's kind of this charismatic figure who gives entertainment to the wealthy, Michaelis. And then the various kinds of administration that kind of follow the whole thing. The key thing is Winnie. She's kind of left out of the group. Everything else are all these men telling other men how the world is. But the only one who actually does anything, and doesn't just talk about it, is Winnie, when she finally realizes that Verloc has killed her son and then kills him instead.
You understand me perfectly, Mr. Verloc. And as far as I can tell, you have done nothing to earn your salary in the last 4 years. Now that I am here, you will have to earn your money. No work, no pay.
Several times I have prevented...
Don't tell me about the old days. The evil is with us now. We don't want prevention. We want a cure. You know there are elections coming up.
I do read the papers.
Well, Portugal must be brought into line. You will agree with me the middle classes are stupid.
They are.
They have no imagination. What we need to do is stimulate them with a really good scare. What's the most important thing to the Portuguese people, Mr. Verloc?
I would say...
You don't know because you're too lazy to think. They don't care about royalty or religion. The fascists drove the aristocrats into hiding, and the church is tainted along with the old regime. See what I mean?
Perfectly. How about the embassies? A series of bombings directed at...
Don't be facetious, Verloc. You could blow up all the embassies in Lisbon without influencing the public one bit. The only thing the Portuguese care about now is the future. They never want to be a backward country again. You anarchists hate the status quo, and since bombs are your means of expression, why not bomb modernity itself? What do you think about an assault on communication?
Communication.
Blow up the Marconi installation at Sesimbra, Mr. Verloc. Sever the umbilical between Europe and the
It's a six-screen video installation, right?
Yeah, there's always at least two screens going on. Sometimes you have six screens playing simultaneously. But the pairs of screens are on either side of the space, and they're in these three rows. And they kind of represent different social registers. There's private space, the space of Verloc and Winnie's home and their cinema. There's public space, which is inside the cinema and the street. And then there's administration, which is where the Secretary of State lives, and the police commissioner, and those kinds of people, and the ambassador, who starts the whole thing. And basically, we sometimes have characters who can navigate all the spaces, and some are stuck in particular kinds of space. But really, it's a condition of being in the middle of two things, and you can't see two things at the same time. So the montage has to happen with your body. you have to decide what to look at various points. In a few cases, there's people talking directly across from each other, and you have to decide which one you want to pay attention to. And so, yeah, it's kind of using the space and the body, in a way, bring together the recombinant aspect of my work from the 2000s and the spatial aspects of the work from the 90s that I was doing in this work.
I understand that music plays an important part in connecting the different narratives on the screen.
Yeah, basically there's one scene where there's a sort of a duo playing it in a bar, and the music they play, there's 6 variations of music. The music they played 3 cycles previously become movie music we hear in various other scenes in the film. There's the conspirators in the projection booth. We hear sort of a tinny sound from the small speaker. We hear music filtering into the lobby of the movie theater, which changes the affect of the various scenes taking place there, which is like when Verloc, or Winnie, the wife of Verloc, understands that he's responsible for the death of her son, and then she kills him. And then when she's getting betrayed by Ossipon, these things are colored by the affect of the music that we hear in the background. And so it's a very subtle thing, but it's the quality of storytelling changes based on this musical accompaniment in the background. Kind of the first time I've ever used real movie music in my movies, even though that's kind of movie music in quotes. We hear movie music from the movie theater being used as movie music in my movie.
And tell me, for the music you worked together with, so you shot and produced in Portugal, but for the the music you worked together with Portuguese musicians, right?
Yeah, a guy named Paulo Furtado, or the Legendary Tiger Man. And my pitch to him was basically, I want to have music that sounds like Suicide playing Clear Spot by Captain Beefheart. And he kind of took it from there with his collaborator.
Okay, but it's very much like, and this was also released, right? At least by the Legendary Tiger Man. Yeah,
exactly. There's a record of that as well.
Stan, which role does music play in your work in general?
I guess the simplest way of saying it is that music, the voices in music really are an embodiment of how people can endure time together, together or alone. And that model of making time-based work has been kind of a fundamental thing I've been mining for most of my career.
What do you listen to, or what is your favorite music?
I guess my favorite music is probably dub music. Dub music and disco remixes, that kind of thing. Yeah, just like there's any kind of like music that's based on this recombinatory procedure, where there's this taking music and using the studio as an instrument, using the whole apparatus as an instrument. This is the things that I really enjoy listening to. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stan, for talking to us, and thank you very much for listening.